much for the introduction, Christos. We're going to talk today about the program planning, budgeting, securing funding, and writing a business case. You've got the agenda in front of you here. We're going to have a quick introduction from me, and then we're going to cover planning for decarbonisation and building a business case in some detail. And then at the end of the session, we're going to have a quick summary and also the opportunity to ask questions. The presenters today are myself, Alistair Wilcock. I've been working with the MEP as a programme manager, and Dave and Chris will be speaking in a few minutes. Dave has been working as a project manager on the programme for some extended period now, and Chris has been heading up the MEP programme for about more than 2 years now, and has been making great strides in that regard. The other two presenters that you can see on the right hand side, they are presenting others in this bite-sized series. So the bite-sized series, there are 5 sessions in all. This is session 1. 3 are happening this week, as you can see from the dates on the slide. And next week we're covering another 2 subjects. And as Christos has said, they're all available to you, so please do join us for future sessions. Thank you again for joining this one. I hope you'll find it really interesting, and I'm sure you'll find the other ones to be interesting as well. So we look forward to having your contribution to those as well. So if we move on to the context of the situation that we are in at the moment with reference to decarbonising the public sector estate. We had our 5th carbon budget set by the Climate Change Commission, and that specifically said that the public sector should reduce its direct emissions by 50% by 2032 against a baseline of 2017's emissions. The 6th carbon budget was somewhat more far-reaching. That was announced by the Climate Change Commission in the autumn, and that is now setting out the targets of 78% reduction by 2035 against the 1990 levels, so a slightly different set of parameters, and that has been put into law earlier this year. So as you'll have gathered from the dates, the target that we were actually working with on the MEP programme is that first one of the 50% direct emissions by 2032, but that certainly takes us on the right route to achieving the 6th carbon budget. In order to meet these targets, the biggest challenge is the scale. There are a lot of public sector sites. There is a huge amount of decarbonisation that is needed. And it requires considerable planning. It requires a very good understanding of the budgets, the projects, and how it's all going to fit together. There are some funding opportunities coming up. The upcoming spending review is getting ever closer. And indeed, the public sector decarbonisation scheme will continue to see funding rounds in the future. So there are opportunities there to gain some further funding and some grant support in order to help this this project to proceed. The aim of the session, we're looking to share insights and learning from the programme that we have been running for the last few years. As Christos has said, we've been doing some of the work at all stages of developing these decarbonisation trajectories and also implementing. So we've got some good insights and some learning which we hope to share with you today, and we've learned some things along the way which we would like to refer to as best practice. We're very, very happy to help you now by answering your questions at the end of the session, but also into the future as well. Our contact details are on the slides, so please feel free to reach out and get in touch. The programme is an innovation programme funded by SICE, part of BEIS, very much in partnership with the Cabinet's Office and with the Energy Systems Catapult, were the organisation that was doing quite a lot of the legwork of the delivery. very collaborative across government. As you can see on the right of the slide, there were a lot of government departments that were involved to varying degrees in the programme, most of them very well embedded. The phase 1 of the project lasted until March 2019, and then phase 2 took on from there and closed around about March 2021, with some extension work just continuing at the moment to finish off and extend some other aspects of the programme. We've been testing the practicalities of net zero by actually doing it. We have a test bed of 42 sites which are shared amongst 3 primary departments, the Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Defence and the National Health Service. You can see the numbers there, and then there's also one site with HMRC and a further university site at Cardiff University. There's a reasonably good representation of the emissions there, both scope 1 and scope 2. Chris will explain the distinction between those in just a minute, so we're able to provide some useful extrapolation as to what that might mean for the wider public sector estate. The 4 Pathfinder sites were the first of the sites that were involved in the phase 1 of the programme. They've progressed from decarbonisation plans to also testing some aspects of the delivery, 3 of those in a meaningful way, and I'll come to those in just a moment on the next slide. 36 of the sites were assessed for submetering, and 23 sites are actually having submetering deployed on them in order to gain some better understanding of the energy usage of the sites. And then 24 of those 6 sites have had decarbonisation plans formulated and provided to them in order to detail a pathway that will achieve those carbon reduction targets of 50% by 2032. So turning to the Pathfinder sites, I mentioned that 3 of them were having real delivery actually underway at the moment. You can see there that the 3 mentioned are Sheppey Prison Cluster down in Kent, the HMS Collingwood, which is a Royal Navy base, and also Goole District Hospital. As you can see there, I'm not going to read all the numbers out for you, but you can see there's some very significant cost savings on an annual basis are being achieved or expected to be achieved. Their estimates will be achieved by operational savings and also reductions in the production of carbon dioxide equivalent from the operation of particularly the heating systems and the electricity systems at those sites. I'll hand over to Chris.
Could you read my lips then when I said, oh, look, I'm on mute? So I thought I would take you through what we've been looking at. So to decarbonise, you could just look at it in a sort of singular linear way, and you could just attempt to remove all emissions from each of the different services that you've got provided on site. But actually, in reality, it doesn't quite work like that because there's interactions. And so what we've come to realise through the programme that we've been delivering is that there's a sort of pathway of different things that need to be considered. So we found that resolving the energy efficiency, which would deliver about 10 to 15% of emissions reduction, is a good starting point. That typically costs about 5% of the total cost of decarbonisation. So you can see that there's a difference in what it contributes to what it actually saves. But it saves, if you do it straight away, more emissions than it will do in the longer run, because quite a lot of the emission savings will come from things like electricity. So a no regrets attempt at doing some of the measures that you won't ever really lose out from. They have low payback periods. So you do your LEDs, your BMS, your VSDs, your HVAC, and you just make sure that everything's operating very well. You also look at your building fabric, because your building fabric, obviously, once you improve that, you need less of a heat demand. Moving on from the heat demand, you find yourself in a position where you're able to remove your fossil fuels because your heat demand's reduced. You need a lower sized heat pump, which reduces the cost of the heat pump. But you also need to take into account that as we move to a world where we've got electrified vehicles, you might need some charge points, and so that adds some demand. So you start to think about what the demand look like at the same time as thinking, hang on a minute, my heat pump is operating at a lower temperature. It's got a wider temperature differential. What have I got to do with my heat distribution system to make sure that I'm going to be able to operate it well? We've learnt that all of the electricity demand might lead to network constraints. We looked at the whole of one of the departments that we're working with, portfolio, and we found that actually around a quarter of it was already constrained. So there were already network issues in the surrounding area, so there were going to be problems, and in the future that's only going to increase. So that's a potential issue. So one way to avert that is to look at supplementing the site with on-site generation, but also thinking about how that demand is then managed. So if there's some demand-side management, some storage or other activity. So that's the sort of way that we started to think about all of the systems. And with that in mind, then we started to realise that if you've got a portfolio of sites, then you've got to do a bit of planning around it. And I feel like I'm very old in this world, but you can do things in a detailed way, or you can do it from a sort of top-down appreciation. So I'm going to just take you through some of the top-down views. Could you click onto the next slide? So you've got to think about two things. First of all, how you're going to plan your portfolio and deliver it. And then secondly, what that will mean in terms of emissions, but also what it will mean in cost. How much is it actually going to cost to decarbonise? And that's the big question, isn't it? And what would you do and when? So what we thought we would do is take you through some of the very basic stuff that I suspect that everyone will know around the emissions predictions, and then link that to where the costs come from and how you would do that planning with a timeline. So if you click onto the next slide, I suspect you're all nodding here going, oh, I've seen this slide before. I know what this image is. That's right. I have borrowed it from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and I've just put the reference of where it's come from down there. So I suspect we all know 7 contributing sources of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide plus the 6 other, which make it up to an equivalent, which is what we now capture. We used to capture carbon dioxide, but we don't anymore. We do it as an equivalent because we've come to realise that they also have issues with the way that they emit and what they do to the atmosphere. Carved up into 3 different scopes. We look at scope 1, which is where you're taking a fuel, primarily a fossil fuel, and you're burning it, and that's known as a direct emission. And then you've got scope 2, which is where you're taking something which has already been turned into a source of power for yourself. That's combined electricity, but also if you're buying heat from a heat network, and that's considered scope 2. And then there's pretty much everything else in those 2 great big arrows with loads of pictures on it, which is scope 3. And for buildings, generally what we look at is scope 1 and 2, and we also look at scope 1 for transport, where we're using our own vehicles and we're using our own buildings. There's a different category for leased buildings, and there's a different category for getting on someone else's aeroplane, which of course we're not all doing at the moment anyway. And so I just wanted to show this to you because there's a big difference between the targets that Alistair's just talked about, which is scope 1 and scope 2, or direct and indirect. So if we just click onto the next slide, at the moment, we've all been led to believe, and quite rightly so, that electricity has got the higher emissions conversion factor. There's a higher emissions impact. But actually, in the future, that's not going to be the case. Because as the national grid and everybody else buys and puts in renewables, and that contributes to the power that's on the national grid, the electricity factor or conversion factor that we see here plotted against time is going to start to reduce. And where I've got that lovely thick dark blue line going across, which is natural gas, there's a crossover point where suddenly actually it's the fossil fuels that are the things that need to be eliminated. And they're going to be where our massive burden of carbon intensity is going to be. Now, I've taken these factors from the Green Book factors. There was a supplementary guidance that was issued in 2019, March 2019. Oh, no, April, I lie. And I put the link down at the bottom of here. And And these factors are the ones that we've been asked to use as part of our programme, and they link to, hopefully, the way in which the UK government is going to assess whether or not it's contributed to its fifth carbon budget. But I think that there's something that it tells us here, that really, at some point quite soon, we all need to start thinking about where we're going with our fossil fuels rather than the electricity stuff. So whilst LEDs, they contribute to the whole system, the underlying issue of network constraints, actually the reality is it's the heat network that needs to be dealt with. So I just wanted to make that point up front because I think it's quite an important point. Can we click on to the next slide, please? So if you've got to plan how you're going to deliver a decarbonisation programme between now and 2032, the first thing to do is to understand what emissions you need to reduce. So using what you've got currently in 2017 as your baseline, 2017-18 because it's the financial year, and then thinking about how your emissions portfolio might change over that time period. So whether you've got acquisitions, disposals, whether you're going to need to have a growth, that there's a change in the estate, any of that, but really mapping it against the emissions factors that I've just suggested out to 2032 will tell you what you've got to do because that gives you your baseline and it gives you your total emissions. And you'll understand what you've got to do in scope 1, scope 2, or direct and indirect. And I think that that's really, really important because that will give you direction about what you've got to start focusing on. That also then starts telling you about how much of your emissions you've got to decarbonise, and you can start to think about what that budget is going to look like, which is what Dave's going to take through. But I don't know whether you've got any comments on what you've just seen, Dave?
No, not particularly. No, I think. We've got feedback. Sorry. I think it's a case of understanding that, and there's a lot of activity to actually get to there before you even start looking at planning what needs to be done and how you're going to do it and actually deliver it. So it really does kind of. It's a long journey, and everybody's kind of needs to be aware and cognizant of that fact before you even get going. I'm Dave Tomlinson. I'm one of the program coordinators and program managers on MET, but it's an absolute pleasure to meet you all today. So I'll be talking to you for the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. Talking about how much things are costing now. So you've had your high level thinking of being actually starting to get down to the weeds of it now. Where do you go, or where do you start to look at, and where are all the important questions about how you figure out costs and budgets? So we've listed some of the things that you may or may not have already experienced here for you to refer through to. So you may have projects that you've already delivered, and you can then extrapolate that out to see what that would mean across your estate, depending on what activity has been done. We do have quite a lot of price estimates that we've developed over the delivery of the Modern Energy Partners programme, and that's been put into a useful tool, which obviously is something that we're very, very happy to talk to you about. Also want to talk about the collaborative state here. You may have other examples from other sites or other departments that have got a similar estate to you. The analogy that we use here is when we talked about the Ministry of Defence. Nearly every site that we looked at had single living accommodation blocks or slab blocks, and we found out that they were kind of built in batches. So you had some built in the 70s, some built in the 80s, some built in the 90s, and they were very, very similar. So it's then trying to identify that and say, well, if we've done something on those buildings and we've got 20 of those across the estate, we can apply that activity across there. And then also there's the OGP Net Zero Trajectory tool that you can use. But the key point of reference, I think, is have a look at doing a couple of these, see if you can try and tie in more than one example of that, because that will help you get better estimating and better data points. So you've got a fair idea now about what you want to do, and you've had a kind of look and start to think about costs, but then you need to kind of think, well, when are we going to start to consider doing this? When are we going to get it done? Especially when you take into account the size of your department estate and drawing upon your own experience and other people's experience that you're working with, and your delivery models and the actual processes that you've got to do this stuff. So we think that the answer is now. So I think, I know it's a little ludicrous of me to say it, but this is an example that we pulled together for the Ministry of Defence. So this is basically a picture that we developed for them for their top emitting sites. There's 36 or 40 of them, I think, broken down over a number of phases. And basically, our experience shows us that it takes at least 2 years to deliver. So this is taking into account the full journey from sitting down, understanding what you wanted to do, doing what we call data discovery, then doing what we call the concept design to figure out what you want to do, and then planning that out in an actual set of deliverables. So if you look at that from a phasing perspective, you can't all start them all at once. You have to do that as a kind of flow diagram, waterfall diagram. You're already running out of space here. So 10 years time, you've still not delivered the last piece. So I think that's a really powerful kind of message that we pulled together to show with the MOD that, you know, time is moving on and you need to kind of look at that now. When you take into account of it, basically we think from our perspective that there are 3 kind of stages for implementation. So you've got your no regrets work, then you've got 2 stages of more focused and energy intervention elements like heat pumps and decarbonising the electrical estate and putting in renewable energies. So that's kind of the program of works that we've pulled out there. So from working up a portfolio, we just wanted to talk to you about the potential options that you might have. You know, it's whilst we focused on the overall end-to-end piece, and remember we were kind of an innovation program, so we were doing the let's learn by doing, and how hard actually is it to do it on the estate, and what kind of time is it going to take us, and what kind of problems that we're going to look at. You might want to consider alternative ways that you want to do this across your estate. So here we've got 3 options for you. Obviously the linear base that we've kind of produced ourselves within Modern Energy Partners. Positives and negatives to that. Obviously it gives you your specific targets and it gives you the pathfinder proposition. So what I mean by that is if you're at all unsure about how you want to go about doing this, it's an option to consider doing one, learning from it, and then applying that learning across the rest of the delivery space. Second option that you've got here for you is focused on type. So that's a specific energy intervention. So you might want to look at that from a no regrets work, LEDs or BMS activity. That definitely gives you economies of scale. It might allow you to have a more, shall we say, direct conversation with your procurement channels to understand what you can get for your money. But I would like to point out, very, very resource hungry. If you're doing this a large number of sites at the same time, that will be quite a significant governance and management ask of the program, notwithstanding the actual implementation elements of itself. And then the last piece is like the full end-to-end picture. So you've got one strategy, it's the whole combination of energy interventions to get you from one end to the other end. So this will give you the full picture. It will give you better financials against business case metrics because you're taking into account various different levels of energy intervention. But it is a big ask. If you were to write a business case to say over the next 10 years I'm going to do this, this, and this, that is quite an interesting proposition to sell to your accountable executives and get that over the line. So I just wanted to share that with you. So we do have additional information coming on that in one of our other bite-sized sessions. So if you're all interested in listening to what we have to say there, please join us at session 5, which is planning delivery. Okay, so pulled together what we've seen here at MEP, working across our MOD, MOJ and NHS partners. Very much a case of nobody's the same. You will know this. You've all got your own bespoke kind of ways of working, ways of operating, ways of delivering, and that might also be split down within actual sites within your estate. So you may have specific sites that have specific requirements. For example, on our case, within the MOJ perspective, different prisons have different categories, which makes it easier or harder to work on there, and the amount of time you can spend on site is impacted because of that. So they do make a difference to the site specifics, so please bear that in mind. And we've shown some high-level figures for you here. Obviously, we can't show you the costs, but key things to look out for here. Look, if you're looking to get towards your 60 to 70% plus emissions and you fairly good abatement, look at that payback period there. Very, very large, and in some cases you're into negative net present value returns as well. So again, something for you to consider when you're starting to position this, never mind do the work. So then, just about a bit of delivery and spend profiles. This is about your cash flow, on what you want to do and when you want to do it. Obviously, this will break it down in specific payment periods that you're identifying and when. So we've drawn this example together for you, to get you starting to think about that. So obviously, it'll be understanding the actual energy interventions that you're doing, the energy interventions that you're delivering, when they deliver, and the costs that are attributable to those. So you might have a large number of works over a distinctive period of time, and you can see a massive cash flow requirement in period 4, year 4, quarter 4, whichever one you do it. So you need to take that into account and figure out how you're going to then capture that and show it in your financials and your planning estimates as you go forward. So a very big spike there. But the message is, once you've spent that, you then start to see the positive cash flows on the back of the energy interventions that you produced and the energy that you're saving and the cost savings. So please bear that in mind.
So the interesting thing here is that the example that we've got here would demonstrate that you wouldn't get a linear decarbonisation. So if you're setting yourself year-on-year targets to reduce your emissions, then you'll need to think about how you blend what you're doing. You can also see that there's a big spike in 1 year, which is what you're likely to get with the cost intervention being a fossil fuel change. So if you're moving that over, that tends to be the most expensive element of your investment. So again, you've got to think about, well, if I'm going to do that, do I need to do a range of those over a time period to allow you to think about whether or not you're going to get decarbonisation in a linear profile, but also your cost and effort expenditure in a linear profile.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, so just then wanted to highlight for you that there are a number of routes maybe available to you that's been mentioned previously, but I just wanted to add a little bit more context to that. So when I mean a business case, I'm talking about what you're doing within your own budgets, your own business case to draw down funds from your own kind of allocated budget. However, are there any options for you to consider where you're doing business as usual works that could take advantage of it? So, for example, is there any asset that's coming to the end of its life that needs to be replaced? Or are you doing any planned maintenance, repairing roofs, doing work on windows or lighting, etc. else that you could kind of join forces with to take into account the spent cost of doing that work on its own, but combining that with an energy intervention piece? Obviously, Alistair mentioned the SAILIX application scheme to get funding. So the only thing I would say here that our experience shows that the key for this is to be able to move quickly, get yourself ready for submission, and have the information that's needed to get the submission in as soon as possible. I think it's I think we all know that the last 2 schemes that have been provided were very, very much oversubscribed, and the funding allocation got eaten up very, very quickly. And the last part is the spending review request that we talked about again. But point to note, is it possible to look at combining those if an opportunity presents itself when you're talking about the more linear and the larger case of development and delivery? So we've got here the business case green book model. We've pulled this together and showed you a summary with the 5 specific areas to focus on. Obviously very conscious that each business case is different and each area is different. You'll have your own nuances to incorporate over and above. But this is what we think is an excellent starting point nonetheless. If you look at the bottom there's a link at the bottom of the page for you to use to go and have a look if you wanted to. So I just want to expand on that a little bit more. So we've broken that down for you into a little bit more of a context. And to show you where we think the effort should be provided, and also some of the key things you might want to focus on. But before we talk about those, just wanted to draw your attention to the stuff in the middle of the slide. The way that we approached our business case funding allocation was in 2 main parts. We did an outline business case first, and then we did a full business case. So the outline business case, which covered off obviously the main areas of focused delivery, but it was specifically restricted to a couple of things. Is some quick wins. So you've identified some variable speed drives that need replacing or something like that. And the second element is that it provided the capability to do the design feasibility, so the detailed design for you to really hammer down the solution that you want to propose, get firm costs, get turn the estimate from an estimate into a firm cost, get a better plan, understand what the problems you are that are going to face, and then that in turn led us then to produce the full business case, which confirmed the scope, and it confirmed the approach, and it confirmed the metrics. So the key, one of the things I want to point out here is that you might get changes between the outline business case and the full business case. For example, when we were working with the Ministry of Justice, one of the at SHEPI, in our outline business case, we wanted to look at upgrading and decarbonising the laundry that's on site. However, we experienced through moving through the feasibility and the commercial discussions with the Ministry of Justice, we had to discount that because we were unable to proceed that. So obviously then that we changed the view of the full business case, but it confirmed exactly what we were going to do. So it allowed you to do a point in time allocation of the activity and the spend that you want to use, and then that moves you through to the full business case itself. So the 5 key areas for you there, I'm not going to walk all the way through those. So you've got strategic case. I think the key thing for me there is you need to look at your department's overall aims and objectives. You probably already have that in some kind of view. You might be linked to a spending review bid or your overall strategy for the department, but it's really important that you put that in there, saying that what your targets are and that you want to achieve. Your economic case is showing you your options, but most importantly, I would say you need to justify why you're going to choose the option that you've considered and proposing. We also included a do nothing option within our documentation, which shows what, if anything, the ongoing costs were that were attributed to just maintaining the status quo, maintenance, things coming to an end of its life, that kind of thing. From a financial perspective, obviously one of the most important parts of the business case, definitely the cost and your savings broken down both within the project deliverables but also against the whole life costs. So for example, we modelled our LEDs over a 20-year life cycle because that's the lifetime of the fitting, which allowed us to include maintenance and replacement costs of the current fittings on site, which I think failed every 3 to 5 years. Commercial case, definitely how you're going to deliver, what your high level plan is, what are your outputs, are you working to your delivery partner, and what risks you've been able to identify that exist now with mitigation factors if you can identify those, and definitely show your activity and your costs and show those for completion in there. The management case, which is one of my personal favourites, and if you've been involved in a lot of business cases, this is where you kind of get into the weeds of actually how you're going to deliver this. It's the governance and then the control element. Your team that's going to be involved in it, your roles and responsibilities, your escalation routes and your key decision makers. As you know, during implementation, it's never smooth sailing. There will always be things that you need to look at, adapt to, manage, change, review, mitigate against. So very much a piece that's key and essential. Just one thing on the top of here, we took an additional step, put an executive summary in there, no longer than 3 pages normally, which highlighted what the key elements of the delivery we were focusing in on, confirmed what we were doing, when we were doing it, and asked the accountable executive to approve the document and the funding. I always try and consider for myself as a project manager your 3 main elements there: time, cost and quality. If you look at the document when you've written the business case and you can see the answer, and more importantly, if you send it or show it or share it with somebody who isn't close to your project and ask them to answer those questions, you've done a good job as far as I can tell. And the other mantra that I kind of live by, which is what we've referred to previously, is that it's who you're going to get involved, what you're going to do, where you're going to do it, why you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, and then tagged on to the business case how much it's going to cost you. So if you just consider those kind of activities as you're writing and completing the documentation, I think you'll be very, very close to the mark. And obviously just wanted to call out, we are going to talk about this in a little bit more detail tomorrow. So if you'd like, please join us at session 2, which is getting into the detail of delivery. Last slide for me, but I just wanted to call out some things that we've experienced and what you want to potentially watch out for. So we thought we'd share these with you based on our experiences in the Modern Energy Programme, and bit of stuff to get your juices going really for you to start when you starting to consider your own activity. So from a time perspective, 2 or 3 things to call out here. I think it's very safe to say that we underestimated the amount of time that was needed for review and approval of our business case documentation. Just a bit of a caveat on that one, because the Modern Energy Partners was classed as a joint funding set of deliverables. So when we were working with the Ministry of Defence, it was a 50-50 split. So it wasn't just one business case within your own stakeholders that you had to manage, it was 2. So we definitely underestimated that, so please take that into account. Another thing that we underestimated was key personnel and actually getting access to them. So it's not just specifically the team that's doing the management and the governance of the programme, but it's actually the people down on the floor at the pointy end of the sword that are delivering the work. So the example we've got here is when we were doing the telemetry and data installations, we very quickly realised that there were 3 or 4 key personnel from each site that we needed to get access to. They were spread very thinly, and getting hold of them and getting them to commit their time was quite a hard ask. In some cases we had to fill in specific forms and request that they make their time available, and that came with a 20 working day lead time. So definitely look at as much information as you can and to try and think about the amount of time it's going to take you to deliver. The department specific processes that might impact you, I used an example there. Ministry of Justice has some enhanced security checks that need to be completed, so there was a period of time that we had to wait until we could actually get on site to do some of the work. There are other nuances that I'm sure that you'll be aware of in your own departments, but just a call out there to look at that. And the last point on the time piece really was about the have a look at other ways to deliver. So the example that we have here for you is when we were working with our Ministry of Justice colleagues, they had a specific set way of delivering work following the REBA process that had a very long timeline of delivery broken into 5 succinct specific phases of work, and initial estimates came in at quite high costs. We were able to work with the Ministry of Justice and do collaboratively to challenge that process. So what we did is we agreed and with Ministry of Justice that there were people actually on site. The current facilities management team were actually doing the work themselves. They were replacing lighting. They had the capability and the capacity to do that. What we needed to do was ramp that up so we could roll that out across the price. And one of the key wins that we got for the program is we were able to significantly reduce the cost of delivery for that specific option and the time that it's taken us to do it. From a cost perspective, all about show me the money here. There are elements here that we learned with our colleagues as we did it. Again, you're talking about department nuances, and again you're talking about specifics that may or may not be applicable to your role. So from our perspective, we had to have escorts when we were working in the prisons. There were specific times when we couldn't work on site, whether that then had to be classed as reduced hours or out of hours working. And also I think a big thing to consider is how you approach your risk and contingency element. So things are going to go wrong, you know that, we all know that, but it's how you want to ring fence any funds that you want to allocate against that. A couple of final things from me about modelling. Be prepared for negative returns. The slide that we showed you previously showed that when you're talking about developing and installing a large piece of energy intervention technology which has a very high cost, logic would dictate that payback period will be quite significant, and it will take a large amount of time for those funds to be recuperated and shown in a positive NPV or internal rate of return. So that is just something for you to consider and start positioning. And again, the other way to deliver was as per what I've just talked about. We've shared with you the business case metrics that we've produced at the bottom. We focused not only on your standard payback, internal rate of return and net present value, but then obviously on the energy savings from both kilowatt hours and a carbon perspective, but also looking at the COPEX capex cost per ton, which was one of the key metrics that we developed. So we have a model that we have developed that allows us to quite quickly model that when we have all the inputs from a cost and delivery perspective. But again, it was very much a rounded view to show the entire element of costs and metrics that were applicable to business case submission. Again, just want to call out that we are going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. So please join us at session 4, setting up a monitoring framework, and at session 5, planning delivery, if you so desire. And I'll hand back over to Christine to summarise.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So actually what I'm just going to say about those different metrics is what we actually found, which was quite interesting. We worked with 5 suppliers and we found quite a lot of inconsistency in the assumptions that they put together for them. So there's definitely an importance in making sure that you've got a framework and you understand what you're asking for. And that the underlying information or calculations that go into them are the same, because otherwise they, we saw abatement, wildly varying over a factor of 10. Right, now then, I've got -1 minute to try and sum up, so I'm going to be really quick. Hopefully that's given you a view of the top-down sort of view of where you can estimate your carbon emissions and what you've got to achieve, how you can estimate how much it's going to cost, and then in practicality how you might start to negotiate where you get your funding from and how you bid for it. We've got loads more information. Dave's sort of crossed over into what we're going to be doing in the other sessions, so I hope that that's going to be really useful to you as well. And I hope that we don't duplicate what we tell you in each of the other sessions and that it gives you a different perspective each time. But one of the things that we will try to cover is skills and resources, capability, and how to challenge to get the best out of your supply chain as well. So the final question to answer is on the last slide, which is what are we going to do next? So Christos alluded to it at the beginning. We have generated loads and loads of material. You can see we've got cost benchmarks, we've got loads of insights about how to do things, we've got assumptions, we've got rule books, we've got principles about what you would do in certain situations and why you would do it. And we're hoping that all of that information over the next 6 months will become available on the government property portal. That will then be free for you to use, and we will also be able to answer questions from you about what we can do. So I'm going to stop there. I can see that Gemma has already put a couple of questions in here, and so if you've got questions, either you shove your hand up